Before we begin tonight, a quick thank you to Felicia Landry, who suggested this topic. Now, let us go somewhere most people have never heard of, a place that once spanned entire continents, a place that appears on some of the most authoritative maps ever drawn, a place that, within the span of a single lifetime, quietly disappeared from the world's memory. Tonight, we follow the name that the world forgot, and ask whether forgetting it was ever really an accident. There is a particular kind of silence that settles over a library late at night. Not an empty silence, a weighted one, the kind that presses in from the shelves and reminds you that every book around you was written by someone who no longer exists. Every map once represented someone's entire understanding of the world, the edges of what was known, what was feared, and what was simply called something else because the people who drew the lines had never actually been there. Our story begins in that kind of silence, with a man hunched over a table in a university archive somewhere in Central Europe, surrounded by cartographic reproductions, maps printed centuries before his grandparents were born. He's not a historian by trade, he's a researcher, a private one, the kind who gets paid to trace genealogical records and property lines. His name, for the purposes of tonight, is Adrian Voss. And what he notices, on a cold Tuesday evening in late autumn, changes the way he thinks about history forever. He notices a word that appears on map after map after map, printed in bold, elegant lettering across an enormous swath of the Eurasian continent. A word he has seen before but never truly looked at, a name he has read in passing without ever stopping to ask what it really meant. The word is Tartaria, and it is everywhere. To understand what makes that word so strange, you have to understand the scale of what it described. On European maps produced throughout the 1600s and 1700s, the region labelled Tartaria, or more precisely Great Tartary, is not a small territory tucked into some forgotten corner of the world. It is enormous. It stretches from the Ural Mountains in the west to the Pacific coast in the east. It encompasses what we now call Siberia, large portions of Central Asia, parts of Mongolia, and in some editions, sections of Eastern Europe and even the far northern territories of the Asian continent. It is, by any cartographic measure, one of the largest named regions ever depicted on a European map of the world, and it appears not in one or two fringe publications, it appears in the most respected and authoritative cartographic works of the era. Guillaume de Lisle, one of the most celebrated French cartographers of the early 1700s, places Tartary prominently on his maps with careful detail. British atlas makers of the same period do the same. The region appears in Dutch publications, German encyclopedias, Italian geographic surveys. It is not a rumour, it is not a myth whispered about in coffee houses. It is standard geography, the same way we today might label South America or Southeast Asia, a broad classification applied to a vast and imperfectly understood part of the world. The Encyclopedia Britannica, in its earliest editions, those thick authoritative volumes that Victorian households kept on their shelves like a second holy text, describes Tartary in earnest, detailed language. It lists populations, it describes terrain, it discusses the region's relationship to surrounding powers. There is nothing tentative about the entries, nothing that reads like a legend or an approximation. Tartary, in the 1800s, was treated as a real geographic fact, as real as France, as real as India, as real as anywhere else on the map. Adrian Voss stares at this word for a long time, then he picks up another map, and another. He lays them side by side across the table, and traces the label with his fingertip, watching it appear and reappear across different projections, different publishers, different decades. He then reaches for a map from the mid-1800s, then a later one, and that is when he notices that the word is gone. The disappearance of Tartary from European maps is not gradual in the way most geographic changes are gradual. Most geographic names evolve slowly. A region gains a new administrative title. The old name lingers in common use for a generation or two, and eventually the transition completes over the span of several decades. That is the normal trajectory. Think of the way Persia became Iran, or Rhodesia became Zimbabwe. Slow, documented, contested at every step. with the old name persisting in conversation and literature long after the official change was made. The disappearance of Tartary does not follow that pattern. In the space of roughly 2 to 3 decades, a blink of historical time, the name vanishes. Maps that in the 1830s still prominently label the region are replaced by the 1860s and 70s, with maps that have divided the same territory into Russian administrative regions, Chinese territorial designations, and the named territories of newly classified Central Asian states. Where a single, continent-spanning label once stood, there are now dozens of smaller classifications, each one bureaucratic, each one precise, each one belonging to a nation-state rather than to any larger cultural or civilizational identity. The efficiency of this transformation is, to put it mildly, unusual. The standard explanation, and it is a reasonable one on its face, is that the Russian Empire's accelerating expansion into Siberia and Central Asia during the 1800s brought administrative order to territories that had previously been only vaguely classified by European geographers. As Russia consolidated control over these vast eastern lands, it reorganized and renamed them according to its own administrative logic. The word Tartary, in this reading, was simply a placeholder, a catch-all label that Europeans used for everything east of the Urals that didn't belong clearly to any known kingdom or empire. When those lands were properly absorbed, classified, and administered, the placeholder was discarded. It had done its job. It was no longer needed. That is the standard explanation, and Adrian Voss does not dismiss it. He writes it down. He considers it carefully. He even finds it partially convincing. But then he starts looking at the buildings. There is a photograph that stops him cold. It is a black and white image, taken somewhere in the Russian interior in the 1870s or 80s. The exact location is unclear, the caption partially damaged. It shows a civic building, a large one, with a domed roof, ornate stone columns, and a facade of layered stonework that would not look out of place on a government building in Paris or Vienna. The surrounding landscape is undeveloped. There are no visible signs of the kind of industrial infrastructure you would expect to support the construction of a building like this. There are no cranes, no railway lines, no quarrying operations visible in the distance. Just the building, sitting there in what appears to be the middle of a largely empty landscape, as if it had always been there. Voss begins searching for similar images. He finds them, not in the dozens, but in the hundreds. Buildings scattered across a vast geographic range, from Eastern Europe to deep Siberia to Central Asia, all sharing certain architectural characteristics that feel, to his untrained but observant eye, remarkably consistent. Domed roofs, tall, symmetrical facades, ornate decorative stonework, interior spaces of unusual scale, designed, it seems, for large gatherings rather than private use. Buildings that local records attribute to the 1800s, but that appear, in their craftsmanship and their scale, to exceed what the documented labour forces and construction technologies of the period could plausibly have produced. He begins calling them something, a term that is his own, informal, not borrowed from any academic tradition. He calls them orphan structures. The name comes from a simple observation. These buildings have no parents in the historical record. There are no letters from architects commissioning their design. There are no ledger entries recording the purchase of materials. There are no first-hand accounts from the workers who built them. There are no civic records of the decisions that were made to construct them. They appear in historical photographs already completed, already aging, already weathered, as if they had simply always existed, waiting for someone to notice them. In some cases, local legend fills the gaps. The building has always been here, the older residents say. We don't know who built it. It was here before our grandparents. But local legend is not documentation. An absence of documentation in the historical record is not the same as absence of history. It means something happened that was not written down, or that the writing was lost, or that the writing was removed. Voss adds a column to his growing spreadsheet. He labels it documentation ratio. For each orphan structure, he records how many documentary sources he can find that relate to its construction, compared to the physical scale and apparent complexity of the building itself. For the structures with clean historical records, the ones whose architects are named, whose commissioners are identified, whose construction ledgers survive, the ratio makes sense. Large buildings have large paper trails. For the orphan structures, the ratio is often dramatically inverted. The buildings are physically enormous. The documentation is a whisper. He does not know what to make of this. But he records it faithfully, as he records everything, because the most important rule of any investigation he learned a long time ago is that you do not decide in advance what the evidence means. You record it first, you decide later. And sometimes, when you lay all the recorded evidence side by side and step back, far enough to see it whole, a pattern emerges that you could not have seen from inside any single piece of it. Voss begins to map the orphan structures. He notes their locations, their approximate dates, their architectural similarities and differences. He builds a rough taxonomy. He observes that certain structural motifs appear consistently across enormous geographic distances, not just in the former territories of Tartary, but in surprising locations further west, and even, in some cases, across the Atlantic. He finds 19th century American civic buildings with the same proportions, the same decorative grammar, the same scale as buildings in the Russian interior that were supposedly constructed by entirely different people, in entirely different circumstances, for entirely different purposes. Now, there are reasonable explanations for this. Architectural styles do travel. The neoclassical tradition, which drew heavily on Greek and Roman forms, was fashionable across the entire Western world during the 1800s. It would not be surprising to find similar-looking buildings in Moscow, London, Philadelphia and Buenos Aires, all built during roughly the same period. That is what a dominant stylistic movement looks like. It crosses borders. It transcends cultural differences. It produces uniformity of aesthetic, even in the absence of any coordinated intention. Voss knows this. He has studied it. He writes it down as a counter-argument and sits with it for a while. But then he notices something that the neoclassical travel explanation does not fully address. It is not just the style that is consistent. It is the scale. It is the apparent purpose. Many of these orphan structures are not government buildings or wealthy private homes, the kinds of institutions you would expect to invest in expensive architectural fashion. Many of them appear to have been designed as public gathering spaces. Large, open interiors, wide entrances, acoustic properties that suggest they were built for sound to carry across a crowd. They were built, it seems, for a public that needed to gather in large numbers, in regions where, according to the official historical record, large populations simply did not exist at the time. The census records, Voss discovers, are where things get truly strange. Population data from the 1800s is by its nature incomplete. Census taking was inconsistent, methodologies varied widely from country to country, and vast regions, particularly in Central Asia and Siberia, were surveyed poorly if at all. Voss knows this. He's not a demographer, and he is careful not to overstate what the numbers can tell him. But certain patterns catch his attention. In particular, he notices what he begins calling demographic gaps, regions where population figures from early in the 1800s are significantly higher than population figures from the middle or latter part of the same century, without any clear documented explanation for the decline. These are not small discrepancies. In some territories, the reported population drops by a substantial fraction within a period of 2 or 3 decades, and the explanations offered in the historical record are thin, vague references to migration, imprecise language about administrative reclassification, footnotes in regional histories that acknowledge the discrepancy without satisfying it. Where did the people go? In some cases, the answer may genuinely be migration, populations moving in response to political upheaval, economic pressure, or military conflict. That was an enormously turbulent period across the Eurasian continent. But migration leaves traces. It shows up as increases in neighbouring populations. It appears in records from the places people moved to, and in many of these cases those corresponding traces are thin or absent. Voss does not have an answer. He's not prepared to claim one. But the gaps trouble him, and he adds them to his growing file alongside the orphan structures and the vanishing maps. It is at this point in his investigation that Voss encounters a specific strain of historical theory that he had previously dismissed, a body of ideas circulating on the internet and in certain self-published books, generally grouped under the informal label of the Tartarian civilization hypothesis. He has seen references to it before and categorized it, as most researchers would, as fringe speculation. But now, sitting in front of his accumulated evidence, the maps, the buildings, the census gaps, he decides to actually read it, carefully, without prejudice but also without credulity. The core of the Tartarian civilization hypothesis is this: the region historically labelled as Tartary was not simply a vague geographic placeholder. It was, according to proponents of the theory, something more, a fragmented memory of a coherent civilization that had once occupied an enormous territory across Eurasia and possibly beyond. A civilization that possessed advanced knowledge, architectural, perhaps technological, perhaps scientific, beyond what the standard historical timeline would predict for the region and period. And a civilization that was, at some point in the 18 or early 1900s, systematically absorbed, fragmented, renamed, and written out of the historical record by the emerging nation-states and empires that replaced it. The proponents of this theory point to exactly the kind of evidence Voss has been accumulating: the orphan structures, the architectural consistency across vast distances, the demographic gaps, the rapid disappearance of the name from maps. They connect these threads into a narrative of deliberate erasure, a coordinated effort by the powers that reorganised Eurasian geography in the 1800s to remove evidence of what had come before. Voss reads all of this with careful scepticism. He notes where the arguments are weak, where proponents make leaps that the evidence does not support, where conspiratorial reasoning substitutes for causal explanation, where the desire for a grand unified theory overwhelms the discipline of ordinary historical inquiry. He annotates these passages in red, but he also notes, with equal care, where the questions are legitimate ones that the standard historical record has not fully answered. The reset hypothesis is perhaps the most dramatic element of the Tartarian theory, and also the most difficult to evaluate. It proposes that the transformation of the Eurasian political landscape in the 1800s was not merely an organic process of imperial expansion and administrative reorganisation. It proposes instead that some form of large-scale disruption, a catastrophe, or a conflict of unusual violence, or some combination of the two, created a rupture in the historical continuity of these regions, and that the civilizational structures that existed before this rupture were not simply absorbed but effectively destroyed, their populations reduced or dispersed, their buildings left standing as monuments without context, their records either lost or deliberately removed. What form might such a disruption have taken? The theorists offer several possibilities, none of them mutually exclusive. One is military, a campaign or series of campaigns of extraordinary destructive scale, one that left broad swathes of the Eurasian interior depopulated. Another is environmental, a catastrophic climatic event, perhaps a volcanic winter or a severe drought cycle, that collapsed agricultural systems across a vast region and triggered demographic collapse. A third, more speculative, involves technologies of destruction that the standard historical record does not acknowledge. The idea that the reset was both military and technological in ways that surviving records were designed to conceal. Voss is not comfortable with any of these explanations in their strong forms, but he notices something that gives him pause. The 1800s were, in fact, a period of significant climatic disruption. The eruption of Mount Tambora in 1815 caused the infamous Year Without a Summer, a global agricultural catastrophe that caused famine across Europe, North America, and Asia. Other volcanic events and climatic fluctuations through the century created real, documented hardship across the world. The standard historical record acknowledges these events, but does not always trace their full consequences in the regions that concern Voss most. He files this away. He does not conclude. He continues. One of the most specific and testable claims of the Tartarian hypothesis concerns library and encyclopedic records. The claim is that the name Tartary, and detailed descriptions of the regions it covered were not simply omitted from later editions of major reference works as a natural consequence of changing geographic terminology. They were, according to the theory, actively reduced, entries becoming shorter, less detailed, and eventually absent across successive editions of the same encyclopedias that once described the region at length. Voss decides to test this claim as rigorously as he can with the materials available to him. He obtains, through the archive and through interlibrary resources, multiple editions of several major encyclopedic works spanning the 1700s through the late 1800s. He places them in chronological sequence and reads the relevant entries, or, in later editions, searches for them where they no longer exist as standalone articles. What he finds is this. The claim is, in broad terms, accurate. Early editions of the Encyclopedia Britannica give Tartary, or Tartaria, a substantial detailed treatment, discussing its geography, its peoples, its relationship to neighbouring territories. Later editions reduce this treatment. The entry becomes shorter. It is eventually reclassified, the name appearing only as a historical footnote within entries about Russia or Central Asia, rather than as an independent subject of study. By the end of the 1800s, the entry has essentially vanished, replaced by the names of the nation-states and administrative regions that have absorbed the territory. Again, the standard explanation is perfectly coherent. As political realities changed and geographic knowledge became more precise, encyclopedias updated their classifications to reflect the new order. That is exactly what you would expect. That is exactly what responsible reference work looks like. But Voss notices that the reduction in the Tartary entries is not accompanied by a corresponding increase in detail about the peoples and cultures of the region. When Tartary disappears as a heading, the cultures that once lived within its boundaries do not get their own dedicated entries. They are absorbed into the general entries for Russia and China and Central Asia, mentioned in passing, given a paragraph or a sentence, then subsumed. The people who were once classified under the broad umbrella of Tartary seem to lose not just their regional name but their encyclopedic presence entirely. For Voss, this is the detail that lingers most persistently, not the disappearance of a name, but the disappearance of the people behind it. He returns for the last time to the buildings. There is a particular structure that has been on his mind since early in the investigation. He first encountered a photograph of it in a regional history of a Siberian city. A brief, dismissive caption describing it as a pre-revolutionary administrative building of uncertain origin. The photograph is old, the image slightly blurred, but the building itself is unmistakable. It is enormous. Its central dome rises to a height that would require sophisticated engineering to achieve, not the primitive techniques you might associate with a frontier outpost in the Siberian interior of the 1800s, but the kind of engineering that implies dedicated professional expertise, organised labour, and access to high-quality materials. The regional history attributes its construction to the mid-1800s. But there is something wrong with that attribution, and Voss cannot immediately identify what it is. He sits with the image for a long time. He compares it to other structures from the same period and region, the ones with documented construction histories, the ones whose architects are named in the record. And then he sees it. The weathering is wrong. Buildings constructed in the mid-1800s and photographed in the 1870s or 80s show a particular kind of surface aging. The soft erosion of recently cut stone, the fresh discoloration of mortar, the specific patina of stone that has been exposed to the elements for 20 or 30 years. The building in Voss's photograph does not show this kind of recent aging. It shows something older. The stone at its base is worn in patterns that suggest not decades of exposure but generations. The kind of smooth erosion that takes a century or more to develop, where weather and foot traffic and the slow chemistry of the atmosphere have had time to deeply transform the surface of the material. The building, if Voss's reading of the photograph is correct, is older than its attributed construction date, perhaps significantly older. He cannot prove this from a photograph. He knows that. Photo analysis is imprecise, weathering rates vary with climate and stone type, and he is not a structural engineer or a materials scientist. He cannot stake a claim on this observation. But he writes it down, he notes it carefully, and he moves on. There is a moment in any investigation when the accumulation of small anomalies reaches a critical mass and forces you to make a decision. Not about what the truth is, you rarely know that, not with certainty, not when you are working with incomplete historical records and interpretations that can be challenged at every step. But you are forced to decide what kind of question you are asking. Are you asking, can I prove this theory is correct? Or are you asking, is the standard explanation sufficient to account for everything I have found? Voss decides, after weeks of research, that he is asking the second question, and his answer to it is no. The standard explanation is coherent and largely defensible. The disappearance of the name Tartary can be explained by imperial reorganization. The orphan structures can be explained by architectural fashion and incomplete record keeping. The demographic gaps can be explained by migration and inconsistent census methodology. Each individual anomaly has a reasonable account attached to it. But the anomalies, taken together, form a pattern, and patterns in history are rarely random. Not because conspiracy is the default explanation. Conspiracy is usually not the explanation. Most historical mysteries dissolve into the ordinary causes: the fire that destroyed the archive, the bureaucrat who never wrote the report, the migration that left no forwarding address. History is full of gaps, and most gaps are accidents, but some gaps are not. Some gaps are the result of people who had reasons not to write things down. Empires that found it useful to let certain histories fade. Nations whose founding narratives required the erasure of what came before. Institutions whose legitimacy depended on the belief that what they replaced was lesser, less organised, less advanced, less worth remembering. It has happened before. It is documented. The destruction of indigenous histories in the Americas, the systematic erasure of pre-colonial African records, the rewriting of Persian and Egyptian histories by successive conquerors. These are not theories. They are established historical facts, acknowledged by mainstream scholarship. Civilizational erasure is not an impossibility. It is a documented human behaviour. The question Voss is left with is not whether civilizations can be erased. History has already answered that. The question is whether Tartaria was one of them. Most historians, if you ask them directly, will tell you that Tartaria was simply a broad geographic label, the European name for the unfamiliar vastness east of the known world. They will tell you that it described no single people, no unified political entity, no coherent civilization, only a patchwork of nomadic and semi-nomadic cultures, diverse in language and tradition, loosely grouped under a name that said more about European, cartographic habits than about any reality on the ground. And this view is, academically, the consensus. It is supported by serious scholarship, by careful linguistic analysis, by extensive archaeological work in the regions in question. The Tartarian civilization hypothesis, in its strongest forms, is not accepted by mainstream historians. Many of its specific claims have been examined and found wanting. The orphan structures, when studied by architectural historians, turn out in most cases to have documented origins, not always easy to find, not always well preserved, but findable. The demographic gaps have explanations that, while incomplete, are consistent with the general turbulence of the period. The weathering anomalies, when examined by material scientists, are often attributable to local geological conditions rather than to unusual age. The theory survives not because its specific claims are unassailable. It survives because it asks a question that the standard record has not fully resolved. Not, was there a lost civilization called Tartaria? But, how much of what once existed in those vast eastern territories have we genuinely accounted for? How confident can we be that the map of history we have inherited is complete? These are not fringe questions. These are questions that serious historians ask about every period and every region. The difference is that in the case of Tartary, those questions have attached themselves to a specific theory, a narrative, a name, a set of images and architectural comparisons that have proven compelling to a very large number of people who feel, for one reason or another, that the official account of history is incomplete. Adrian Voss does not publish his findings. He's not a historian, and he knows it. He assembles his notes into a document, a long, carefully organised analysis of everything he has found, and sends it to a historian he knows at a university in the north. He does not expect to change anyone's mind. He does not expect to resolve anything. The historian writes back several weeks later. The reply is long and thoughtful. It acknowledges that Voss has asked genuine questions. It explains, methodically, whether mainstream scholarship addresses those questions and where it does not. It recommends several books. It is by any measure a respectful and engaged response. But at the end of the letter, the historian adds a single line that Voss returns to many times in the months that follow. The line says, "You are right that the record is incomplete. All records are. The question historians must always answer is how much of what is missing was lost, and how much was let go." Voss keeps that letter. He frames it, eventually, and hangs it above his desk. He's not sure what it proves. He's not sure it proves anything at all, but it keeps him thinking, and it keeps him returning, on quiet evenings, to the old maps. The maps are the part of the story that lingers the longest, not because they prove anything definitive, but because of what they represent, the accumulated cartographic knowledge of an entire era, drawn by people who believed they were recording the world as it truly was. These were not mystical texts or sacred documents. They were working tools, used by merchants, by military planners, by ship captains and colonial administrators. When they labelled a region Tartary, they were not inventing something. They were naming something that existed in some form in the shared understanding of their time. It is worth pausing to appreciate what it took to produce those maps. The cartographers of the 1700s were working with limited instruments and fragmentary information. The accounts of travellers, the reports of merchants, the claims of diplomats who had ventured into territories that most of their contemporaries would never see. Every line they drew was an act of synthesis, an attempt to organise imperfect knowledge into coherent form. And they were careful as their era and their tools permitted. They disagreed with one another. They revised their own earlier editions. They added and removed labels as better information arrived. They were, in other words, doing what researchers do, trying to make the world make sense from the information available to them, knowing that the information was incomplete, trying to be honest about the difference between what they knew and what they guessed. And those careful, imperfect, earnestly produced maps, every one of them, showed Tartary, showed it as real, showed it as vast, showed it as a feature of the world worthy of prominent labelling alongside the great empires and continents that everyone agreed existed. For more than 2 centuries, no serious European cartographic work omitted it. It was as fixed a feature of the geographic imagination as the Mediterranean Sea or the Indian subcontinent, and then it was not. And then, within a generation, it never had been. The mechanisms of that change, political, administrative, cultural, are reasonably well understood. New powers drew new maps. New institutions wrote new encyclopedias. New educational systems taught new geographies to new generations of children, for whom the word Tartary would eventually be as foreign as the languages once spoken by the peoples it described. That is how it usually works. That is how history has always worked. Every age produces a map of the world based on what it knows, what it controls, and what it needs to be true. And when the age passes, the map goes with it, replaced by the next one, which is also imperfect, also partial, also shaped by the needs of the people who drew it. The question that the story of Tartaria leaves us with is not whether this process happened. It clearly did. The question is what it cost. What information was simplified away? What people were reclassified out of their own identities? What structures were left standing without explanation? What populations were absorbed without accounting? What names were removed from maps one edition at a time until no one alive remembered what they had described? Consider what it would mean for a civilization to be not destroyed but forgotten, not bombed into rubble or buried under volcanic ash or swallowed by the sea, but simply reclassified, renamed, reorganized under new administrative structures, its people given new identities by new authorities, its buildings left standing but stripped of context, its history rewritten into the margins of other histories that needed to be primary. It would leave exactly the kind of traces that Voss found. Inconsistencies too small to constitute proof. Anomalies too scattered to constitute a pattern, unless you were willing to look at all of them together, to spread the maps across the table and trace the word with your fingertip across one century, and then lift your finger and find it gone in the next. It would look, from the outside, exactly like what the standard explanation describes: geographic standardization, imperial reorganization, the normal mechanics of empire, because those things would be part of it, the legitimate processes of political change through which civilizational erasure is most commonly achieved, not through dramatic destruction, which leaves evidence, which invites inquiry, which can be remembered, but through patient administrative action, through the slow redrawing of lines, through the replacement of one name with many smaller names, through the accumulation of small decisions made by reasonable people with practical goals, none of whom ever needed to acknowledge the totality of what they were doing. That is what makes the story of Tartaria so difficult to resolve, not because the evidence is overwhelming, it is not, but because the kind of erasure the theory proposes would be designed to leave no overwhelming evidence. It would be designed to leave exactly what we find: a word on old maps, a pattern of unusual buildings, a set of incomplete demographic records, and a nagging sense that the explanation we have been given is sufficient or but not complete. There are 6 words that appear in the title of an 18th century atlas entry that Voss keeps returning to. They are not dramatic words. They're not the kind of words you would use to title a conspiracy theory or a documentary. They are simply descriptive, the way atlas entries always are, precise and dry and authoritative. The words are Great Tartary, its extent and peoples, 6 words, and then, in later editions, 4, and then 3, and then, in the editions that appear after the middle of the 1800s, nothing. No entry, no heading, no cross-reference. The phrase its extent and peoples, which implies, with those 4 words alone, an entire world of territory and human life, simply gone, as if it had never been written, as if there had never been an extent to describe, as if there had never been any people. It is worth stepping back at this point and sitting with what we actually know, because the history of cartography is in many ways a history of what people chose to name, and what they chose not to. The medieval European maps called the Far East the land of the Tartars, a term borrowed partly from the name of the Tatar peoples who swept across Eurasia under the Mongol expansion, and partly, legend has it, from a conflation with Tartarus, the classical underworld. The name carried from the beginning a quality of otherness, of threat, of the unknown. It was a word that said, "Here be people we do not understand, in a land we cannot fully see," and perhaps that is all it ever was, a name for the unknown, a label applied to everything that lay beyond the reliable reach of European knowledge, vast, diverse, only partially mapped, populated by hundreds of different cultures speaking dozens of different languages, united by nothing except their position beyond the horizon of the familiar. When Russia expanded into that vast space and brought it under administrative control, the unknown became known, or at least named differently, and the old label fell away, because it had always been a label for ignorance rather than for any specific place. That is the humane and humble reading of the story. It is probably the most accurate one, and yet, even the humane reading contains within it a quiet tragedy. Because the peoples of that vast, imprecisely mapped territory did not think of themselves as nameless. They had their own words for who they were, their own songs for the landscapes they moved through, their own stories about the world and their place in it. The label Tartary was never theirs. It was given to them by people who had never met them, who had only heard rumours carried along trade routes, who needed something to write in the blank space on the parchment. From the inside there was no Tartary. From the inside there were hundreds of distinct peoples, each with their own name for themselves and their own understanding of where they ended and the next people began. The cartographic label was always a European convenience, not a lived identity. But that is precisely what makes its disappearance so complicated to assess. Because when the label was removed and replaced by administrative designations imposed by expanding empires, Russian gubernias, Chinese prefectures, colonial territorial names, those new designations were also not the names those peoples would have chosen for themselves. They moved from one externally imposed label to another. The question of what was lost is not the question of what Tartary itself meant. It meant different things to different people, most of whom had no say in what they were called. The question is what happened to the hundreds of specific, particular, richly lived cultures that occupied that space when the empires arrived with their maps and their new names and their administrative machinery. And the honest answer is, we do not fully know. We have pieces. We have ethnographic records, some of them careful, some of them careless, some of them shaped by the biases of the researchers who produced them. We have archaeological evidence, increasingly rich as excavation technologies improve. We have oral traditions, some preserved and some not. We have gaps, and we have the uncomfortable knowledge that the people who created the gaps had reasons to create them, and that those reasons were not always innocent. But the humble reading does not preclude the possibility that things were lost in the transition. The transition from the unnamed to the named, from the broadly classified to the precisely administered, is not a costless one. When you replace one large name with dozens of smaller ones, you change the way people think about the space those names describe. You change what questions get asked. You change what continuities get traced and what discontinuities get normalized. You change what ends up in the encyclopedia entry and what gets quietly omitted. And you change what the next generation is taught to remember. Questions are strange things. They do not require answers to be powerful. Some of the most durable questions in human history have remained unresolved for centuries, not because the answers are unknowable in principle, but because the information needed to answer them was lost or was never recorded, or was recorded and subsequently destroyed by the very processes that made the questions interesting in the first place. These questions persist not in spite of their irresolvability, but because of it. Because the human mind is built to find patterns, to seek completion, to reach instinctively toward closure. And when closure is unavailable, the reaching itself becomes a kind of occupation. You return to the question the way you return to a room where you know something is missing, not because you expect to find it today, but because leaving it behind entirely feels like a surrender. Voss returns to the maps the way other people return to unfinished sentences. He is not expecting a revelation. He has been in this business long enough to know that historical research rarely produces that kind of moment. What it produces instead is a slow accretion of context, an increasingly detailed understanding of what was and what is now absent, and what the distance between those two things might mean. It is unglamorous work. It is quiet work. It is exactly the kind of work that belongs in the small hours of the night, when the archive is empty and the overhead lights are low and the only sound is the occasional turn of a page and the soft reminder that you are surrounded by people who no longer exist, trying to understand a world that no longer exists through records that are incomplete by design. That is history. That is always what history is. And the story of Tartaria is, in that sense, the story of history itself. The story of how the past is made and unmade, named and renamed, remembered and let go. Tonight, when you close your eyes and the world outside falls quiet, Tartaria will still be out there, not as a place you can visit, not as a civilization you can excavate, but as a question. A question that lives on the edges of old maps and in the proportions of buildings whose origins no one fully documented, and in the spaces between encyclopedia entries that were once detailed and became brief and then disappeared entirely. It is the kind of question that history is full of, the kind that does not resolve cleanly into either proof or disproof, but sits in the ambiguous middle ground where most of the genuinely interesting historical territory actually lives. Most historians will tell you, with confidence and with good reason, that Tartaria was a geographic label and nothing more. And they may be entirely right. The weight of academic consensus supports that view, and academic consensus, for all its imperfections, exists for good reasons, because it represents the collective judgment of people who have spent their careers examining the evidence with care and rigour. But most historians will also tell you, if you press them, that the record of human civilization is not complete, that there are gaps, that things have been lost, simplified, reclassified, and in some cases deliberately obscured throughout human history, for reasons both banal and calculated. That the map of the past we've inherited was drawn by specific people with specific interests, and that those interests did not always align with the preservation of every detail of every civilization that preceded the one doing the drawing. Adrian Voss knows this. He knew it before he started his investigation. He knows it now, looking out from the archive window at the same night sky that once looked down on mapmakers sketching the outlines of a world they could not fully see. He does not know what Tartaria was. He does not know what was lost when the name was lost. He knows only that something was there, that a word appearing on hundreds of authoritative maps, in dozens of encyclopedias, in the formal geographic vocabulary of an entire era of human scholarship, does not simply dissolve into nothing. Something was there. Something had an extent. Something had peoples. And whatever it was, its name is gone now. One map at a time, one edition at a time, until the world that once stretched across continents became, in the end, just a word in an old atlas that no one living was taught to read. The Sleepy Koala Army, thank you as always for being here, for making it to the end of another night together, another quiet hour in which we followed something strange and uncertain through the dark. If tonight's episode left you with questions, that was entirely intentional. The best histories always do. They remind us that the past is not a finished document, but a living argument, one that keeps changing as new evidence is found, as old evidence is reconsidered, as the people doing the examining bring new eyes to things that were looked at and set aside a long time ago. Tartaria may have been nothing more than a label for the unknown, or it may have been the faded echo of something much larger. The truth, as it so often does, probably lives somewhere between those two possibilities, in the complicated, imperfect, richly human space where most historical reality actually resides. Wherever you are tonight, whatever time zone you're drifting in, whatever city or countryside is quiet around you right now, I hope this kept you company through the dark. I hope it gave your mind something soft to rest on as sleep arrived. And if you have a moment before you go, if your hand is still near your phone, if the Spotify app is still open somewhere on your screen, a review there takes 10 seconds and means more than I can adequately say. It helps the channel find its way to people who need exactly this kind of quiet company in the night. You're standing at the edge of something ancient. Not ancient the way your grandmother's house feels ancient, with its peeling wallpaper and photographs of people whose names no one remembers anymore. Not ancient the way a Civil War battlefield feels ancient, where you can almost hear the cannons if you close your eyes and let the silence work on you long enough. Not even ancient the way the Egyptian pyramids feel ancient, those towering geometric impossibilities rising from desert sand that has seen 40 centuries of human ambition come and go. The Appalachian Mountains are ancient in a way that makes all of those things feel like they happened 5 minutes ago. They were here before the Atlantic Ocean existed, before the dinosaurs walked the earth, before complex animal life had figured out how to drag itself onto dry land and breathe open air for the first time. When these mountains were young, the planet itself was still working out the basic grammar of its geology, still learning what it wanted to be. The Appalachians rose during a collision of continents so massive and so slow that the peaks they produced once stood as tall as the Himalayas, sharp, white, impossible towers of stone scraping a sky that had never once been touched by human eyes. Then, over the course of hundreds of millions of years, they wore down. The glaciers came and went. The seas rose and retreated. The continents drifted apart and the Atlantic poured itself into existence between them. Species evolved, dominated the earth for tens of millions of years, and went extinct without ever knowing this mountain range existed. And still the Appalachians stood, quieter than they once were, rounder, gentler looking, but still there. There is something profoundly unsettling about that kind of age when you actually sit with it, when you let the numbers become real in your mind rather than just abstract geological trivia. 480 million years, a span of time so enormous that the entire human story, every war, every empire, every invention, every name anyone has ever remembered or forgotten, fits inside it the way a single sentence fits inside an encyclopedia. The Appalachians existed for 479,999,000 years before the first anatomically modern humans ever stood upright on the African savanna. Whatever these mountains are, they were already unimaginably old before we arrived. And the question that certain researchers, certain historians, certain geologists working in classified government programs have been quietly asking for over a century and a half is this: what if something else arrived first? What if something else has been here the whole time? Act 1. The mountains before history. The disappearance at Pisgah. The night of September 14th, 2023 was clear and cold in Pisgah National Forest. Daniel Mercer had been planning this trip for 3 months. A 41-year-old logistics coordinator from Asheville, North Carolina, he was the kind of person who kept meticulous journals about his hiking experiences, who spent his weekends studying topographical maps the way other people studied box scores or financial reports. He had hiked more than 4,000 miles of trail over the course of his adult life. He had completed sections of the Appalachian Trail in 6 different states. He had solo backpacked in the Cascades, in the Adirondacks, in the mountains of northern New Mexico. He understood risk. He understood wilderness. He was not a beginner making a beginner's mistake. He had told his wife, Rebecca, that he would call on the morning of the 15th. He had left her a precise itinerary. He was carrying a GPS tracking device registered to a service his wife could access from her laptop at home, a service designed specifically for situations where cellular service was unavailable, transmitting his location every 30 minutes via satellite uplink. The last transmission came through at 2:13 in the morning, not because the battery died. The device's charge log showed 62% battery remaining at the time of the final transmission, not because he turned it off. The device had no off switch accessible to the user without specialized tools. The signal simply stopped. Rebecca Mercer reported her husband missing at 7:45 the following morning, when his promised call did not come. By 9:30, rangers were moving toward his last known coordinates. By early afternoon, a full search party had been assembled. Rangers, volunteer search and rescue teams, a tracking dog unit brought in from a neighbouring county. They found his campsite intact. His sleeping bag was laid out neatly, unzipped, as if he had simply stood up and stepped out into the night for a moment. His hiking boots were placed beside it, side by side, in the precise way a person arranges shoes before going to sleep. Not kicked off carelessly, but deliberately set down. His headlamp was on the ground near the tent entrance. His pack was inside, organised exactly as it would have been at the end of a hiking day. His camp stove had been used for dinner. A partially eaten meal of dehydrated pasta was still in his cook pot, scraped clean on one side and abandoned on the other, as if he had stopped eating mid-meal for some reason and simply never returned to it. The fire was still warm. Park Service personnel quietly reduced the official search radius 48 hours after the operation began, citing resource limitations. No explanation was given for why the radius was reduced rather than expanded, as is standard procedure when a missing person has not been located. The search was formally suspended after 9 days. Daniel Mercer has never been found. There is no note, no sign of an animal attack, no evidence of a fall or a medical episode, no footprints leading away from camp in any direction that the tracking dogs were willing to follow. At a certain point, a point the handlers later described with visible discomfort as approximately 150 yards from the campsite in a northwesterly direction, all 3 dogs simply stopped, sat down, refused to move forward. His file remains officially open. It sits in a drawer alongside hundreds of others just like it, stretching back through decades and centuries, a quiet archive of people who walked into these mountains and were never seen again. The age problem. To understand what may be happening beneath the Appalachian Mountains, you first need to understand what the Appalachian Mountains actually are. Not the way a travel brochure describes them. Scenic rolling hills, gorgeous fall foliage, charming small towns tucked into river valleys. Not even the way a geology textbook describes them, with their clinical language of sedimentary strata and tectonic plate convergence. You need to understand them the way a person who has spent a lifetime studying ancient rock formations and come away genuinely disturbed understands them. The Appalachians formed during an event geologists call the Tectonic orogeny, which began approximately 480 million years ago. This was a period of catastrophic continental collision, when the land masses that would eventually become North America and what is now West Africa slammed into each other with geological slowness and geological violence, pushing the ocean floor up between them into mountain ranges that made today's peaks look like gentle hills. At their maximum height, roughly 350 to 400 million years ago, the Central Appalachians may have reached elevations comparable to the modern Karakoram Range, peaks approaching 25,000 feet, glaciated and ice-carved, standing in a world where the air itself was chemically different from what we breathe today. Then the continents separated, the Atlantic opened, the mountains began their long erosion, ground down over hundreds of millions of years by ice and water and the patient, remorseless weight of geological time. What remains today are the ancient roots of those original peaks. Tough, compressed, metamorphic rock that survived while everything softer was carried away to the sea. And here is where it becomes interesting. Not publicly interesting. Not interesting in the way that generates academic papers and press releases. Interesting in the way that generates quiet conversations between geologists at conferences, observations made in careful language that stops just short of stating the conclusion everyone in the room is already drawing. Certain sections of the Appalachian Range exhibit what structural geologists describe as anomalous compression patterns, rock layers that, according to standard models of tectonic pressure and erosion, should not be compressed the way they are, folded in directions that do not match the expected stress signatures of the collisions that formed them, showing evidence of forces acting from angles and directions that do not correspond to anything in the known geological record of the region. The phrase that appears in internal communications among researchers at the United States Geological Survey, never in published papers, always in emails and handwritten margin notes and conversations that the participants later declined to discuss publicly, is structurally wrong. As in, sections of this mountain range in their deep interior are structurally wrong. As in, the rock is behaving as though it was shaped by something other than the geological processes we understand. No one publishes this observation. No one presents it at conferences. It exists in a quiet, uncomfortable space where professional geologists acknowledge it among themselves and then go back to their offices and write papers about things they can fully explain. But the observation does not go away. Something is wrong with these mountains. in a way that becomes more apparent the deeper you go. The voices beneath the earth, long before European settlers arrived with their compasses and their mining equipment, and their deeply inadequate understanding of what they were walking into, the people who actually knew these mountains had already drawn their conclusions. The Cherokee Nation's relationship with the Appalachian Range was ancient and complex, and held a specific quality of reverence that was distinct from the reverence they held for other sacred places. The Cherokee did not avoid these mountains. They lived in them, built their towns in the river valleys between the ridges, drew their identity and their cosmology partly from the landscape that surrounded them. They knew the Appalachians with the intimacy that comes from thousands of years of continuous presence. And there were specific places they did not go, not places they avoided out of simple superstition or unfamiliarity. Specific valleys, specific ridgelines, specific hollows accessible only through particular passes that experienced hunters and warriors would walk miles out of their way to circumvent. Places with names in the Cherokee language that do not translate cleanly into English. Names that carry connotations of something hidden, something listening, something present in a way that does not conform to the normal categories of the natural world. The oral tradition of the Cherokee passed through generations with the careful fidelity of people for whom oral transmission was the primary means of preserving knowledge, describes these places in consistent terms across different storytellers, different time periods, different parts of the mountain range. Speakers beneath the earth is a phrase that appears in multiple recorded accounts, a description not of supernatural beings in the European fairy tale sense, but of something literal and physical, something that makes sounds that travel upward through the ground, something that communicates. Hunters who entered certain valleys returned describing sounds they could not identify. Low rhythmic vibrations felt more in the chest than heard by the ear, coming from no identifiable direction, seemingly from the rock itself. Some hunters entered certain passes and did not return. Their tracks were found going in. No tracks came out. No sign of a struggle. No evidence of what had happened to them. The Shawnee, who occupied a broad range from the Ohio Valley into the eastern mountains, maintained similar traditions about specific Appalachian locations. Their oral accounts describe places where hunters disappeared without explanation, where the ground itself seemed to breathe, where experienced woodsmen would suddenly lose all sense of direction in terrain they knew perfectly well. Places where dogs refused to hunt, where horses refused to be led, where the normal behavioural patterns of every animal species broke down completely. Certain ridges were abandoned, certain valleys were forbidden. The knowledge of which places these were and why they were dangerous was passed carefully from generation to generation, treated with the seriousness of life or death practical information rather than the narrative looseness of mythology. These were not stories, these were warnings. No one among the European settlers who began arriving in significant numbers in the 18th century bothered to ask why. Act 2. The first discoveries, the surveyor's notes, 1770s. The systematic European exploration of the Appalachian interior began in earnest during the 1770s, driven by land speculation, colonial expansion, and the practical need to understand a mountain range that formed a significant geographic barrier between the established eastern settlements and the vast interior of the continent. The surveyors and explorers who pushed into the mountain wilderness during this period were not naive men. They were experienced frontier navigators, skilled woodsmen, people accustomed to the genuine physical dangers of the American wilderness: bears, catamounts, hostile encounters, exposure, injury far from any medical help. They were the kind of people who recorded their experiences with practical precision, noting compass headings and water sources and terrain features with the same matter-of-fact attention they would have given to listing the contents of their supply packs, which makes the anomalies in their journals all the more striking. Among the most famous figures of this period was Daniel Boone, whose journeys through the Cumberland Gap and into the Kentucky interior brought him through some of the most remote and least-known sections of the Appalachian Range. Boone was not given to fancy or exaggeration. His recorded observations have been verified by historians as generally reliable and meticulously precise. He was, in the clearest possible sense, a trustworthy witness. His journals from certain expeditions now held in historical archives contain entries that do not fit neatly alongside the practical frontier navigation that characterises most of his writing. There are references to compass behaviour that he describes with evident puzzlement, instruments spinning freely in their housings in locations where no natural explanation was apparent, disorienting navigation in terrain where his own considerable woodsman's skill could not compensate for the inability to establish direction. These weren't isolated incidents he dismissed as equipment malfunction. They occurred repeatedly in specific locations in a manner consistent enough that he began to note the geographic coordinates of the affected areas in his journals as places requiring special navigational caution. There are references to sounds at night, sounds emerging from the hollows and valleys below his camping positions described as a low hum or vibration that he associated with no known natural phenomenon. Not wind, not water, not the sounds of large animals moving through underbrush. Something he had no word for, described with the careful precision of a man trying to report something accurately, despite having no adequate vocabulary for it. And there are references to animal behaviour that Boone, who had spent his adult life reading the behaviour of wild animals as a survival tool, found inexplicable. Horses refusing to enter specific passes despite being perfectly willing to traverse much more challenging terrain in other locations. Dogs that hunted eagerly everywhere else, simply lying down and refusing to move when brought into certain valleys. Deer and elk absent from areas that appeared to offer ideal habitat, as if the animals had been avoiding these locations for so long that their avoidance had become encoded in their local behavioural patterns. These observations do not appear in the official records compiled from Boone's expeditions. They appear in his personal journals, documents that were not originally intended for publication or official use. Some of the most specific entries in the original journals have been noted by historians as absent from the transcriptions that were made and preserved for the historical record. Someone, at some point, made a decision about what should be remembered and what should not. Boone was not the only surveyor making these observations. The records of frontier mapping expeditions throughout the 1770s and 1780s contain scattered references to compass anomalies, unexplained sounds, and animal behaviour that experienced woodsmen found impossible to explain through conventional means. These references appear in journals and personal letters. They rarely appear in official reports. The omissions are consistent enough to suggest a pattern, not a conspiracy necessarily, not yet, simply a shared, perhaps unconscious decision among practical men that certain observations were too strange to be useful, too inexplicable to be creditable, better left out of the official record where they might cast doubt on the reliability of the reporter. But taken together, these scattered accounts from the first systematic exploration of the Appalachian interior describe a range of phenomena: electromagnetic anomalies, acoustic anomalies, anomalous animal behaviour, that cluster in specific geographic locations, reappear consistently across different observers and different time periods, and resist any conventional explanation. The mountains were trying to tell the early explorers something. The early explorers, for the most part, chose not to listen. The Lost Tunnel reports, 1800 to 1830. By the early 19th century, the economic potential of the Appalachian Mountains had become a primary driver of their exploration. Coal, iron, copper, salt. The region's mineral wealth was enormous, and as the young American Republic expanded and industrialized, the demand for those resources drove men deeper into the mountains and deeper into the earth than the frontier surveyors had ventured. The mining operations that spread across Kentucky, West Virginia, Virginia, and Tennessee during the first decades of the 19th century were rough, dangerous enterprises by any standard. The men who worked them were accustomed to underground environments that would have terrified most people. Low ceilings, bad air, the constant possibility of collapse, the disorienting darkness that settled over you the moment your lamp went out. They were not easily frightened. They were not prone to reporting things that made them sound unstable or unreliable. because in an industry where your safety depended on your co-workers' trust in your judgment, a reputation for seeing things could be genuinely dangerous, which is why the reports that emerge from certain mines during this period are so difficult to dismiss. The pattern repeated itself in mining operations across multiple states, separated by geography and time, conducted by different companies with different workforces. Miners breaking through to natural cave systems was not unusual. The Appalachian region is riddled with limestone caverns, and encountering them during underground excavation was a routine occupational hazard. What was not routine was what certain mining crews found when they broke through into specific cave systems in specific locations. Natural cave formation follows predictable rules. Caves form in limestone through the action of slightly acidic water dissolving the rock over long periods of time. The passages they create are irregular, shaped by the random flow of water, narrowing and widening unpredictably, following the path of least resistance through the stone. The walls of natural caves show the scalloping and rippling produced by water flow, the stalactites and stalagmites produced by mineral deposition, the rough, organic irregularity of a system shaped by the blind operation of chemistry and physics. The systems that certain miners broke into were different. The walls were smooth in a way that water erosion does not produce, a quality that experienced cave explorers, when they were later brought in to examine the systems, struggled to explain. Not polished precisely, but worn in a manner that suggested long passage rather than water flow. The angles of the passages were unusual, descending at grades that seemed deliberately measured, maintaining consistent widths over distances that natural cave systems simply do not maintain. The geometry was wrong in a way that was difficult to articulate, but immediately apparent to anyone who had spent significant time in natural cave systems. Miners reported warm air currents rising from deep within these systems, not the cool, stable temperatures characteristic of natural caves, but warmth that increased with depth, suggesting a heat source far below that defied geological explanation in regions where no volcanic activity existed and no mining operation reached deep enough to encounter geothermal heating. Sounds carried through these systems in ways that disturbed the men who heard them. Not the dripping of water or the settling of stone that miners were accustomed to hearing underground, but rhythmic, patterned vibrations that some described as resembling, distantly and eerily, something like breathing, something like a heartbeat translated into the language of stone. Several mines were abruptly abandoned following the discovery of these systems. The owners cited various practical reasons. The passage had not led to productive mineral seams, the geological formation was unstable, the expense of further excavation outweighed the likely return. In most cases, the government, first territorial, then state, then federal as the relevant areas achieved statehood, acquired the mineral rights to the abandoned properties within months of their closure. The timing, repeated across multiple locations over multiple decades, was noticed by at least some of the people involved. But what could be done with the observation? The rights were acquired legally. The prices paid were fair. There was nothing to contest, no law broken, no complaint with any obvious remedy. The properties passed into government hands. The access tunnels were sealed. The records of what had been found inside were filed away under classifications that would not be invented for another 100 years, stored in a bureaucratic system that was still learning how to make things disappear. ACE 3. The Civil War Secret. The Confederate Mining Collapse, 1863. The American Civil War brought industrial-scale excavation to the Appalachian region, on a scale that the earlier mining operations had not approached. Both the Confederate and Union sides had critical military need for the iron, coal, and saltpeter that the mountains contained, and both sides pushed their mining operations harder than peacetime economics would have justified. In the spring of 1863, in a remote section of eastern Tennessee, a hidden Confederate iron mine collapsed. The word hidden here is significant. This was not a registered commercial operation. It was a military extraction site, its location kept from Union intelligence, operating under conditions of secrecy that meant its existence was officially denied and its documentation was minimal and classified at the highest levels available to the Confederate military administration. The collapse itself was catastrophic. 37 men were underground at the time, working a seam that the military engineers had assessed as safe based on the geological surveys available to them. The cave-in happened suddenly, without the warning signs that usually preceded such events. No preliminary cracking of support timbers, no preliminary settling of the floor that would have told experienced miners to get out. The roof came down all at once as if something had simply decided to close. Rescue teams were assembled immediately. The Confederate military could not afford to lose 37 trained men and a working iron operation, and the engineers who led the rescue operation were skilled and motivated. What they found stopped them. The collapse had exposed a cavern system that the original mine excavation had not detected, a system that, as the rescue teams worked their way through the fallen stone trying to reach the trapped miners, revealed itself to be far larger than any natural cave formation should have been in that specific geological context. The engineers estimated, from what they could see, that the chambers extended downward at an angle that would have placed their lower reaches several hundred feet below the mine floor, below the depth at which the limestone formations that typically produced cave systems in the region even existed. The walls of the exposed chambers displayed the same smooth quality that miners in Kentucky and West Virginia had reported 40 years earlier, a quality that the Confederate engineers, who had extensive experience with natural cave systems, immediately identified as anomalous. The geometry of the passages, what they could see of it before the rescuers were ordered to stop advancing, was too regular. The metallic echoing was what ended the operation. Several of the engineers and senior rescuers heard it separately and described it independently in language that converged on the same impression. A sound coming from deep within the exposed chambers, metallic in character, rhythmic in pattern, resembling nothing that should have been present in an unmined, uninhabited underground space. Not the sound of water, not the sound of settling rock, not the sound of the trapped miners, who would have been making very different sounds if any of them were still alive and capable of making noise. Something that sounded to multiple independent witnesses like a pattern, like something being produced deliberately. The workers refused to continue the rescue operation. The engineers tried everything. Appeals to duty, threats of military discipline, physical compulsion, and accomplished nothing. The men who had gone furthest into the exposed system simply would not go back. Several of them resigned from the Confederate service entirely rather than return to that mine. The rescue was formally abandoned. No official reason was given for why the effort to recover 37 men was halted before all possible options had been exhausted. The war records pertaining to this incident were classified under the Federal Reconstruction Archives following the Union victory. The Confederate military records absorbed into the federal system and immediately sealed under classifications that would keep them inaccessible to researchers for more than a century. The 37 miners were never recovered. Their names appear on no memorial. The Federal Geological Survey, 1872. The formation of the United States Geological Survey in 1879, with significant survey work beginning several years earlier in the 1870s, represented the first systematic, scientifically rigorous effort by the federal government to understand the geology of the American West and interior. For our purposes, what matters is what happened when early survey scientists turned their attention to the Appalachians. The Appalachians presented a different kind of scientific challenge than the dramatic landscapes of the West. They were old, familiar, heavily settled, a mountain range that had been part of the American consciousness since the first colonial settlements. Whatever they contained had been there all along, weathered down by geological time, apparently offering no dramatic new mysteries of the kind the West was producing. The early survey geologists quickly discovered they were wrong. Deep subsurface analysis of the Appalachian Range, using the seismic and geological techniques available at the time, which were cruder than modern methods but already capable of detecting large-scale underground structures, revealed something that the survey's internal documents begin referring to, by the early 1880s, as the subsurface void network. The language is careful. Void network is a neutral term that simply describes a connected series of underground empty spaces, which could, in principle, simply mean a large cave system. But the survey geologists were not describing a large cave system in the normal sense. The voids they were detecting were too large, too deep, too regularly distributed. Their spacing along the mountain range was consistent in a way that natural cave formation, which follows the random distribution of soluble rock and water flow, simply does not produce. The internal notes of the geologists who first mapped these features use the word symmetrical, with an anxiety that is almost palpable even through the formal scientific language of the period. Cave systems are not symmetrical. The forces that produce them are random, uneven, governed by the specific local conditions of water chemistry and rock composition. A symmetrical cave system is, in the strictest geological sense, a contradiction in terms. The subsurface void network was symmetrical. The survey's official published reports from this period contain nothing about these findings. What appears in the archives, in the internal correspondence, the unpublished field notes, the annotated maps that were stamped for internal use only and filed away from the documents intended for public distribution, tells a very different story than what the survey was telling the public. The voids extend from somewhere in northern Alabama to somewhere in southern Pennsylvania. They run, with remarkable consistency, along a north-south axis that correlates almost precisely with the axis of the mountain range above them. They lie at depths ranging from several hundred to several thousand feet below the surface, too deep to be affected by the surface geology in ways that would explain their formation. The survey geologists who made these observations wrote to each other about them in language that, for scientists of that era, amounts to expressions of profound disquiet. They had no explanation. They did not publish their findings. They did not present them at scientific meetings. They filed them away, classified them internally as sensitive, and moved on to other projects. The subsurface void network sat in the archives waiting to be found again. Est 4. The humans who went missing. The pattern in the disappearances. Take a map of the Appalachian range. Starting from northern Georgia, draw a line northward through the Great Smoky Mountains, through the Blue Ridge, through Shenandoah, through the mountains of central Pennsylvania. Mark on this map every documented disappearance of a person in the wilderness of this region from 1870 to the present day. Every hiker, every hunter, every child, every camper who walked into these mountains and did not come back. You will notice something. The disappearances are not distributed randomly across the mountain range. They cluster. They cluster in specific locations along a north-south corridor that runs with disturbing consistency through the same areas that the early survey geologists identified as locations of the subsurface void network. The same areas where Daniel Boone noted compass anomalies in the 1770s. The same areas where mining operations were abandoned in the early 1800s. The same areas where Cherokee and Shawnee oral tradition placed their forbidden valleys and their warnings about what lay beneath the earth. Researchers who have analysed these disappearances in detail, notably the author David Paulides, whose multi-volume work on the subject has attracted significant attention among both serious researchers and the broader public interested in unexplained phenomena, have noted a series of characteristics that appear with unusual consistency across cases separated by decades and geography. The circumstances of these disappearances tend to resist the conventional explanations that usually account for wilderness fatalities. People get lost in wilderness areas. People fall and injure themselves. People underestimate weather or terrain and make fatal errors. These are the ordinary tragedies of wilderness experience, and they leave behind evidence. Search dogs can track a person who walked away from a trail. Medical examiners can determine cause of death when a body is found. The normal investigative tools of search and rescue can usually reconstruct what happened. In the cases that cluster along the Appalachian corridor, the normal investigative tools fail. Dogs refuse to track. not lose the scent, refuse. Experienced tracking dogs that have worked hundreds of cases simply sit down and will not proceed in certain directions. This behaviour, reported by handlers who describe it with visible discomfort in interviews, occurs at specific geographic boundaries, as if the animals are encountering something they recognise as a line they will not cross. Bodies, when found, are sometimes discovered in locations that search teams had already covered, in areas that rescuers are certain they searched, in terrain that an incapacitated person could not have reached, in positions that suggest they were placed rather than that they fell or crawled to where they were found. Children who are found alive sometimes describe experiences that are impossible to reconcile with what their physical condition suggests should have happened. Children who should have been suffering from extreme exposure after days in wilderness conditions are found warm and uninjured. Children who could not have walked the distances involved are found miles from where they disappeared. Some of them describe encounters with the people in the woods, accounts that investigators file under the assumption that children, traumatized and disoriented, create explanations for experiences they cannot understand. The pattern holds across more than 150 years of documented cases. The corridor is consistent. The clustering is statistically significant enough that it has been noticed by National Park Service researchers who have, to date, declined to publish or formally acknowledge their findings. Whatever is happening in these mountains, it has been happening for a very long time. The Civilian Conservation Corps, 1930s. The Great Depression brought the federal government into the Appalachian Mountains in a new and systematic way. President Roosevelt's Civilian Conservation Corps, the CCC, was one of the signature programs of the New Deal era, employing hundreds of thousands of young men from across the country in conservation and infrastructure work throughout America's national forests and parks. In the Appalachians, CCC crews built the trail systems, fire roads, and park infrastructure that millions of visitors still use today. They worked in some of the most remote and difficult terrain in the mountain range, living in camps that were often far from any town, spending months in a landscape that most of them had never experienced before. The records of the CCC's Appalachian operations are extensive and well preserved. The agency maintained detailed logs, correspondence, and personal accounts. It was, in many ways, a thoroughly documented organisation, which makes the gaps in those records all the more noticeable to researchers who look for them. Several camp journals, the day-to-day operational logs kept by camp supervisors, have been lost from the archives in a manner that the records management officials responsible for these collections have never been able to explain. Not damaged or deteriorated, not misfiled, simply absent from collections where their presence is documented in finding aids and inventories prepared before they disappeared. Among the surviving accounts, personal letters, diaries kept by individual workers, oral histories collected by later researchers, a consistent set of observations appears with a frequency that cannot be attributed to the folklore transmission that inevitably occurs when large numbers of people live closely together. Workers at certain camps in certain locations reported lights moving through the forest at night. Not lights associated with any known human activity. No lanterns or torches carried by other CCC workers or local residents. No vehicle headlights on roads that did not yet exist. No explanation that anyone involved considered satisfactory. Lights moving at heights and speeds and in patterns that did not correspond to any natural phenomenon the workers knew. Workers reported feeling vibrations through the ground, a low-frequency oscillation that they could feel through their boots and bedrolls but could not hear clearly, a sensation described consistently as something happening deep underground, not nearby. Workers who slept on bare earth reported these vibrations waking them at night. Workers who mentioned the vibrations to supervisors found the subject quickly redirected. In at least 3 documented instances, work crews assigned to specific areas were suddenly and without explanation reassigned to locations miles away from their original work site. The reassignments came from above the level of local supervision, from regional CCC administrators who offered no explanation to the camp supervisors other than a restatement of the order. In 2 of these cases, the workers who'd been removed never returned to their original sites. In the 3rd case, workers who were briefly returned to finish specific tasks reported that the area felt different, that something about the landscape had changed that they could not specifically identify, but that made all of them uneasy. The CCC supervisors who documented any of this in their official reports found their reports reviewed and edited before filing. The nature of the edits, in cases where both draft and final version survive, is consistent. Specific observations about unexplained phenomena were removed, replaced with bland notations about routine operational decisions. Act 5. World War II Discovery Signal Interference, 1943. By the early 1940s, the electromagnetic strangeness of certain Appalachian locations had become more than a nuisance. It had become a military problem. The United States Army, preparing for the possibility that American soil might become a theatre of war and training personnel in the communications technologies that modern warfare required, established training installations throughout the eastern United States. The Appalachian region was a natural choice, remote enough for realistic field conditions, accessible enough for logistics, with terrain that provided useful challenges for training troops who might eventually operate in mountainous European environments. The communication difficulties began almost immediately. Radio communication, which was by 1943 a primary operational tool of the modern military, essential for battlefield coordination, behaved in the Appalachian training areas in ways that should not have been possible. In specific geographic zones, radio signals were absorbed, reflected, or distorted by mechanisms that the Army Signal Corps engineers assigned to investigate the problem could not identify. The interference was not caused by weather, which was the standard explanation for radio anomalies. It was not caused by natural geological features in any way that the available science could explain. It occurred in specific locations with specific consistency, regardless of atmospheric conditions. The phenomenon that most disturbed the Signal Corps investigators was what they called delayed echo transmission. Radio signals broadcast into certain mountain zones returned as echoes, which, in itself, was not unprecedented, as radio wave reflection from geological features was a known phenomenon. What was unprecedented was the delay. Natural radio wave reflections return almost instantaneously. The echoes occurring in the Appalachian anomaly zones returned with delays measured in minutes. For a radio wave travelling at the speed of light, a delay of minutes implies a propagation path of millions of miles. There was nothing, in any direction, that should have been reflecting these signals at that distance. The signals were being transmitted into the mountains and returning from somewhere that the physics of electromagnetic wave propagation did not allow. The Signal Corps filed classified reports. Monitoring equipment was installed at several locations in the worst affected zones. The areas were designated in military communication as electromagnetic irregularity zones, a designation that triggered specific protocols for communication routing that would avoid the affected areas without requiring personnel to know the specific reason for the routing. The underlying explanation for what was happening in these zones was never found. The monitoring equipment, upgraded and expanded over the following decades, continued to document anomalies without explaining them. The installation of that monitoring equipment, however, had a side effect that no one initially anticipated. The equipment was listening, and the equipment began to pick up transmissions it was not meant to receive. Project Deep Echo. The program that would eventually be formalised as Project Deep Echo began as an informal working group within the Army Signal Corps in late 1945, as the end of World War II redirected the energies of the military's scientific establishment toward questions that the urgency of wartime had not allowed them to explore. The core of the program's interest was the acoustic and electromagnetic data being recorded by the monitoring stations installed in the Appalachian irregularity zones. The delayed echo transmissions had continued throughout the war. The monitoring equipment, sensitive enough to detect extremely low-frequency signals, was also picking up something else, a consistent signal emanating not from the surface or the atmosphere, but from underground. The signal was not random noise. Random noise from underground sources, geological activity, hydrological movement, the various sounds a planet makes as it shifts and settles, has a characteristic randomness that can be mathematically analysed and confirmed. The signal the monitoring stations were detecting did not have that characteristic. It had what acoustical engineers describe as temporal structure, patterns of varying intensity and frequency that recur in ways that random noise does not. Project Deep Echo was formally established in the late 1940s with a mandate to determine the origin of these signals. The classified program brought together acoustical engineers, geophysicists, seismologists, and a category of specialists that the program's classified budget documents describe simply as xenobiological consultants, a term that appears without further elaboration in the surviving documentation. The program's primary technical achievement was the systematic use of controlled seismic events, essentially precisely measured underground explosions, to map the subsurface of the Appalachian Range using the reflection of seismic waves from underground structures. The technique was available for decades and had been used extensively in oil and gas exploration. What made the Project Deep Echo surveys different was their scale, their depth, and their geographic coverage. The results confirmed and dramatically exceeded what the United States Geological Survey had detected in the 1880s. The subsurface void network was real. It was larger than the survey's early mapping had suggested, far larger. The chamber system extended from somewhere in northern Alabama to somewhere in central Pennsylvania, following the axis of the mountain range with a consistency that the program's geophysicists described in their reports as impossible to attribute to natural geological processes. The chambers were connected by passage systems at multiple depths. The deepest chambers mapped by the seismic surveys lay at depths that put them well below any geological formation that should have produced a void of their size, and the chambers were too symmetrical. The word appears again and again in the Project Deep Echo documentation, each time with the same uncomfortable quality of a word being used to describe something the writer knows should not exist. The chambers were too symmetrical, the passages too regular, the overall architecture of the system too consistent across too great a distance to be the product of the geological forces that produce natural cave systems. The program's xenobiological consultants, whoever they were, whatever that title actually meant, produced a classified assessment that is referenced but not reproduced in the surviving documentation. The assessment's conclusions are described in the program director's summary report as consistent with the hypothesis that the structures predate the current configuration of the mountain range and incompatible with natural geological formation under any process currently understood. The structures in the Appalachian subsurface were not formed by geology. They were there before the mountains existed in their current form. Whatever made them when the Appalachians were still young, or possibly even before, during the hundreds of millions of years of geological time that preceded any species capable of making such structures. The program continued. Ast 6. The Cold War years. Underground infrastructure. 1950s and 1960s. The Cold War provided the United States government with a remarkably convenient justification for a significant escalation of its activities in the Appalachian region. The nuclear threat posed by the Soviet Union made the construction of hardened underground facilities for government continuity and military command an obvious and easily defended expenditure. Congress appropriated funds. Engineering firms with the highest security clearances were contracted, and across a 2-decade span, the mountains of the American East became home to one of the most extensive underground construction programs in the world. The publicly known examples are significant. The Greenbrier facility in West Virginia, which operated as a secret congressional relocation center for more than 3 decades before being exposed by a Washington Post investigative report in 1992, gives some sense of the scale of the effort. Raven Rock Mountain Complex in Pennsylvania, which continues to operate as an alternate Pentagon command center. Mount Weather Emergency Operations Center in Virginia, a primary continuity of government facility that has never been fully open to public inspection. These are the facilities the public knows about. They are presented as the Cold War government's response to the nuclear threat. Isolated, purpose-built underground bunkers constructed from scratch in convenient mountain locations. But engineers who worked on some of these projects, engineers whose security clearances have long since lapsed, who are now in their 70s and 80s and talking to the people who will listen, describe a consistent anomaly in the construction process. The facilities that were built in specific locations that, when mapped, correspond with uncomfortable precision to the nodes of the subsurface void network, did not require the same amount of initial excavation that comparable facilities in other locations required. In some cases, what the construction crews expected to be months of rock removal was accomplished in days, because the rock that should have been there had, in effect, already been removed. Natural chambers of the right size and configuration existed in exactly the right locations, as if they had been placed there to receive the government facilities that would one day be built inside them. This is not the kind of observation that gets put in official construction reports, but it gets mentioned, quietly, in the oral accounts of people who were there. The official explanation for the Cold War underground construction program in the Appalachians was nuclear preparedness. The facilities were built to survive nuclear attack and maintain government continuity. This is true as far as it goes. What the official explanation does not address is why specific locations were chosen over others that were geologically equivalent. What it does not address is the internal documentation, preserved in classified archives that researchers have accessed through partial Freedom of Information Act requests, suggesting that site selection for these facilities was guided by something other than the surface geology and engineering assessments that are the standard criteria for underground construction. The facilities were built where they were built because the government knew what was already there. The Cold War gave them the cover story. The program gave them the access points, and the access, once established, went both ways. The Appalachian Sounds. By the 1950s, something had changed in the acoustic character of the mountain range. The residents of rural West Virginia and Kentucky, the people who lived in the hollows and valleys between the ridges, who had lived there for generations, who knew the sounds of the mountains the way they knew the sounds of their own breathing, began reporting something new, not unprecedented. Their grandparents had told stories of sounds from the deep hollows, of vibrations felt through bare feet on warm summer nights, of low humming that the old-timers associated with the mountains themselves in the same way they associated the creek sound with the creek. These were old stories, embedded in the folklore of mountain communities with roots going back 2 centuries. But the sounds that people were reporting in the 1950s were louder, more frequent, and they were coming from places that had previously been quiet. The descriptions that appear in local newspaper accounts, in letters to county officials, in the records of state geological surveys that were occasionally dispatched to investigate complaints, are remarkably consistent. A low, resonant droning, not the high-frequency buzz of insects or the sharp sounds of mechanical equipment, but something felt as much as heard, a vibration that entered the body through the feet and the chest rather than the ears, coming from below the ground at a frequency that conventional audio equipment struggled to capture clearly. Trumpet noises is a phrase that appears repeatedly in the accounts, an attempt by people without technical vocabulary to describe something that vaguely resembled the lowest register of a brass instrument, but came from everywhere and nowhere at once, from the ground itself, at times of day and night when no natural acoustic explanation was available. The official response from state and federal geological authorities was consistent. The sounds were attributed to coal mining operations, to the natural settling of rock formations, to atmospheric acoustic phenomena. These explanations were delivered with the confident authority of institutional science and accepted, officially, by the agencies and newspapers that received them. Internally, the picture was different. An internal memorandum from a federal geophysical research agency, partially released in a Freedom of Information Act response in 2008, with significant portions redacted, describes monitoring data from the Appalachian Acoustic Surveillance Network that contradicts the public explanation. The membrane states, in the portion available to researchers, that the sounds being reported by residents originate below the depth of active mining operations in all affected counties, and that their acoustic signature is inconsistent with any mechanical or geological source currently operated or known to exist in the relevant geographic areas. Below the depth of mining operations, inconsistent with any known source. The memo is dated 1959. The sounds continue to be reported to this day. Act 7. The creature theory, the wildlife reports. Not all of what has been observed in the Appalachian wilderness fits neatly into the category of acoustic or electromagnetic phenomena. There is another category of observation, stretching across more than a century of documented reports, that requires a different kind of explanation. Game wardens and park rangers, the people who spend the most time in the most remote sections of the mountain range, whose professional lives are organised around observing and understanding wildlife, have filed, in numbers large enough to constitute a pattern, reports of encounters with something that does not belong in any existing wildlife catalogue. The descriptions share common features with a consistency that cannot be attributed to folklore transmission among professional wildlife managers who typically have no contact with each other's reports. Figures that are unmistakably not the wildlife species known to inhabit the region. Tall, pale, thin, taller than any human, with a quality of movement that witnesses consistently describe as fundamentally different from either human or animal locomotion, as if the mechanics of how it moves through space don't follow the same principles that govern the movement of every other living thing the observer has encountered. The eye reflection reports are particularly striking. Wildlife eyes reflect light in the dark. It's a function of the tapetum lucidum, a reflective layer behind the retina that improves vision in low-light conditions. Every experienced outdoors person knows what animal eye reflection looks like, and can generally identify species by the colour and intensity of the reflected light. The eye reflection described in these reports occurs without an external light source. In absolute darkness, where there is nothing to reflect, the observers nevertheless report seeing eyes that appear to emit their own pale luminescence, watching from distances at which the resolution of the visual image should not be possible. Movement through cliff faces. This detail appears in more than a dozen independent reports from different geographic locations across different time periods, and it is the detail that makes these accounts most difficult to process rationally. Witnesses describe seeing figures that appear to pass into or out of solid rock, moving through the face of a cliff or stone outcropping as if the surface were permeable, leaving no trace of an opening behind them. The witnesses who report this are not, in most cases, people who have any interest in reporting unusual things. They are professional wildlife managers, law enforcement officers, military personnel conducting exercises in the area. They are people for whom seeing something inexplicable is professionally awkward rather than exciting. These reports were filed through official channels. They were processed through the standard wildlife incident documentation system, and somewhere in that system they received a classification that does not appear in the standard wildlife incident taxonomy, a designation stamped across the relevant files in a form that appears in the surviving documents as two words that someone, at some point, decided constituted an adequate category. Subterranean fauna. Whatever these things are, someone in the federal wildlife management system decided they were fauna, living things, and that they were subterranean, and whoever made that decision made it within the existing bureaucratic framework, assigning a category to something that should have prompted an entirely new framework, as if the acknowledgement could be safely contained by the act of naming it. The biological hypothesis. The classified biological assessment that Project Deep Echo produced in the early 1950s represents, as far as can be determined from the surviving documentation, the first formal government attempt to understand what the Appalachian anomalies actually were in terms of a living hypothesis. The hypothesis that emerges from the programme's documentation, reconstructed from references in summary reports, budget justifications, and the partial FOIA releases that have become available over the past 3 decades, is this. During the Appalachian mountain range's original formation, approximately 400 to 500 million years ago, an isolated environment was created in the deep subsurface that persisted as the surface geology changed above it. This environment, the subsurface void network, maintained stable conditions over geological timespans that make all of recorded human history look like a rounding error. In that environment, in conditions of total darkness and extreme geological stability, over hundreds of millions of years, a biological lineage evolved. The lineage's origin is the most contested element of the hypothesis. The biological assessment, as referenced in the surviving documentation, apparently considered multiple possibilities, from an independent origin of complex life that ran parallel to the surface evolutionary history, to a divergence from surface species that occurred so long ago that the two lineages share nothing recognizable, to something stranger that the summary reports decline to specify. What the assessment apparently concluded is that whatever the lineage's origin, it has had hundreds of millions of years to develop adaptations suited to its environment. Those adaptations, as reconstructed from the biological assessment references, are striking. Vision optimized for environments where bioluminescent biological sources, rather than external light, are the primary visual input, which would explain the eye reflection reports, and would explain why the reflection appears to be emitted rather than reflected in standard optical terms. Acoustic sensitivity and production capability far beyond what surface species have developed. The ability to produce and receive extremely low-frequency sound that travels efficiently through rock and earth, sound that humans feel rather than hear, sound that can propagate through the subsurface void network over distances of hundreds of miles. Spatial navigation ability based on acoustic mapping of underground environments, essentially a sophisticated biological sonar capable of constructing and maintaining detailed 3-dimensional models of complex underground terrain, allowing movement through the subterranean system with precision that surface humans with the best available technology cannot match, and a behavioural pattern, apparently deeply encoded relating to the surface world and the surface organisms that periodically enter the mountain wilderness above the subsurface void network. The biological assessment's conclusion on this point, as referenced in the program director's summary, is that human entry into certain geographic zones above the network triggers what the assessment describes as defensive survey response. Not an aggressive predatory response, not an attack, something more careful than that, and in some ways more disturbing, an observation response. Act 8. The modern investigation. The journalist Evan Calder spent 3 years building the case before he understood what case he was actually building. He had started where most serious researchers into Appalachian disappearances start, with the data itself, the raw numbers and geographic coordinates of missing persons cases, the frustrating patterns that kept emerging from the statistics and kept resisting the conventional explanations that official sources offered. He was a podcast producer and investigative journalist with a specific talent for the kind of patient, detail-oriented research that turns a scatterplot of apparently unrelated data points into a coherent argument. He had the missing persons data. He had the historical records of mine enclosures and land acquisitions. He had the partial FOIA releases from the Geological Survey archives, including the fragments that referenced the subsurface void network, without ever fully describing what it contained. He had the acoustic monitoring reports with their careful language about sounds originating below mining depth. The alignment came to him gradually, and then all at once. The missing persons clusters matched the subsurface void network mapping almost exactly. The mining closures of the early 19th century mapped onto the network nodes. The land acquisitions that followed those closures mapped onto the network nodes. The military training areas designated as electromagnetic irregularity zones during World War II mapped onto the network nodes. The Cold War underground facilities mapped onto the network nodes. Everything mapped onto the same underlying geography. Everything that the federal government had been doing in the Appalachian region for 2 centuries, The acquisitions, the designations, the facilities, the monitoring had been organised around a geographic framework that the public did not know existed. Calder spent 6 months attempting to get official responses from the relevant agencies. The National Park Service did not respond. The United States Geological Survey provided standard public information documents. The Department of Defense declined to comment on classified programs. The responses were precisely calibrated to provide the appearance of engagement without providing any actual information. He decided to go see for himself the restricted valley. The hollow Calder chose to investigate was not on any public trail map. It appeared in the survey's public geographic databases as a blank, a section of terrain within the national forest boundary that the available record simply failed to document, as if a small geographic area had been editorially removed from the official record of what existed in that part of the mountains. He had found references to it in a CCC-era internal document, a memo from a camp supervisor to a regional administrator, discussing a work crew's unexpected encounter with a geographic feature that the supervisor described as a thermally anomalous depression with magnetic interference characteristics. The supervisor had been seeking guidance on whether to include the hollow in trail planning. The guidance he received in the annotated response returned to him and preserved in the archive was a single word: no. Calder hiked in from a secondary trailhead, moving off trail through second-growth forest on a clear October morning. The temperature at the trailhead was 58 degrees Fahrenheit, cool but comfortable for hiking, appropriate for the elevation and the season. He carried a GPS device, a compass, a thermal imaging camera, and audio recording equipment sensitive enough to capture infrasound frequencies below the normal range of human hearing. The temperature drop began approximately a mile from the coordinates he was targeting. Not a gradual change consistent with increasing elevation, or the movement into a shaded valley. A relatively sudden decrease of approximately 12 degrees over a horizontal distance of less than a quarter mile, crossing what appeared to be an invisible boundary in the forest. The trees on either side of the boundary were identical in species and size. The terrain showed no feature that would explain the temperature differential. His compass failed at approximately the same point. Not spinning, the way the frontier surveyors had reported, simply ceasing to indicate north with any consistency, the needle drifting and settling in directions that bore no relationship to any consistent reference point. He switched to his GPS device, which continued to provide coordinates, but noted that the device's internal compass function had also ceased to function correctly. The sound reached him before he was within visual range of the hollow itself. Low is an inadequate word for what he recorded. The audio data from that day, which Calder later had analysed by an acoustics laboratory, whose staff had worked with NASA's infrasound monitoring network, showed energy concentrated primarily in the range of 0.1 to 2 Hz, frequencies so low that human hearing cannot detect them in the conventional sense, frequencies that are perceived by the body as vibration rather than sound, entering through bone conduction and proprioception rather than through the ear. The vibration was consistent, rhythmic, structured. The acoustics lab report describes its temporal pattern as non-random, with a period consistent with biological rather than geological rhythmic processes. A careful scientific way of saying that it had a rhythm, and that the rhythm resembled a heartbeat more than it resembled anything a rock formation produces. The thermal camera showed something he had not anticipated. The surface of the hollow was normal, rock and soil and fallen leaves showing thermal signatures consistent with the ambient temperature of the space. But approximately 4 meters below the surface, the thermal camera was detecting movement. Not geological movement, not the slow thermal differential produced by underground water flow or geothermal gradients. Movement that changed position between frames, that appeared and disappeared, that followed trajectories consistent with something navigating a space rather than with any passive thermal process. Something was moving beneath the ground. Calder stayed for 2 hours. He did not see anything on the surface of the hollow. He heard nothing audible in the conventional sense. but the infrasound continued the entire time he was there, and the thermal camera continued to show movement below the surface. And then, as he was preparing to leave, it stopped. Everything stopped. The infrasound cut out as abruptly as if someone had thrown a switch. The thermal camera showed nothing below the surface. The forest around the hollow went silent in the way that forests go silent when every living thing in them simultaneously decides that something significant has happened. He packed his equipment and left quickly, not running, but moving with the focused urgency of someone who understands, on a level below rational analysis, that they should not be where they are. He did not look back. Act 9. The revelation. The declassified fragment. The document arrived in response to a Freedom of Information Act request that Calder had submitted 14 months earlier and largely forgotten about, buried in a queue of similar requests that typically produced either a formal denial or a stack of heavily redacted papers offering nothing of substance. This response was different. The release was partial. 4 pages out of what the cover sheet indicated had been a document of considerably greater length, with the remaining pages withheld under exemption citing national security and internal government deliberations. The redactions within the 4 available pages were extensive, black bars covering passages of text that could be sensed but not read, blocks of deleted material that represented entire paragraphs, entire sections of analysis and observation that someone had decided, even after more than 50 years, could not be shared with the public. But enough remained. The document was headed Appalachian Subsurface Monitoring Directive, 1971. The agency of origin had been redacted. The names of the signatories had been redacted. The specific program designation had been redacted. What remained was a fragment of bureaucratic language that had the quality of all the most significant government documents. Dry, careful, precise, written in the specific style of people who know that what they are describing is extraordinary and have determined that the best way to manage that extraordinariness is to describe it in language so ordinary that it disappears into the bureaucratic background noise. Several lines in the surviving text have been reproduced in Calder's published account of his research and have been verified as authentic by document authentication specialists who examined the original release. One line reads, "Contact avoidance remains primary objective." A second reads, "Population stable, behavioural patterns consistent with previous reporting periods." A third reads, "Surface awareness unacceptable, remediation protocols to be maintained." Calder stared at these 3 sentences for a very long time before he understood what they meant. Not individually. Individually, they were impenetrable in the way that all bureaucratic language is impenetrable, drained of context and specificity by the redaction surrounding them. Together, they told a story. Contact avoidance remains primary objective. There is something to avoid contact with. The avoidance of contact is not an accident, not a passive consequence of the something's behaviour, but an active goal, a primary objective, the most important thing the program is trying to accomplish. Someone has decided, and someone has formalised the decision into institutional language, that contact must not occur. Population stable. There is a population, not a geological formation, not an electromagnetic phenomenon, not an acoustic anomaly, a population of something. Something that exists in sufficient numbers to have a population that can be assessed for stability, that can be described as not growing or shrinking in the way that populations grow or shrink. Surface awareness unacceptable. The something, the population, can become aware of the surface. This is not a given. It is a condition that can occur and that the monitoring program is designed to prevent. The surface, meaning the human world, the populated world, the world above the mountains, is something that the population can become aware of in ways that are considered, by whoever is running this program, to be unacceptable. Remediation protocols to be maintained. When surface awareness does occur, there are protocols, actions taken to correct the situation. The word remediation, in a context like this, carries the weight of something done not just once, but repeatedly. as a standing procedure, applied whenever the condition it is designed to address arises. The government was not studying a geological anomaly. It was not monitoring an electromagnetic phenomenon. It was not managing a wildlife population in the conventional sense. It was managing a relationship between the surface world and something beneath it. A relationship that had been going on for long enough to require ongoing management, stable enough to be described in terms of consistent behavioural patterns, significant enough to have generated a classified monitoring directive in 1971 with roots in programs going back decades before that. The disappearances, the mining closures, the restricted areas, the monitoring stations, the Cold War bunkers built into pre-existing cavities, all of it organised over more than a century and a half around the management of a relationship that the public did not know existed. The government was not hiding monsters beneath the Appalachian Mountains. It was preventing interaction between two populations that had spent hundreds of millions of years evolving in separation, two populations that had now been pushed by the expansion of human civilization deeper into the mountain wilderness, into enough proximity that the old natural buffers were no longer adequate. It was acting in the dry language of bureaucratic management as a buffer. The national parks and national forests of the Appalachian region, managed, protected, kept as wilderness, kept free of the development that had consumed so much of the Eastern American landscape, were not solely what they appeared to be. They were a management strategy, a way of maintaining the separation that the monitoring program required, a way of keeping human populations dense enough to be monitored but sparse enough in the deep wilderness not to trigger the response that deep wilderness entry provoked. The mountains were managed. The wilderness was managed. The disappearances, the ones that happened when management failed, when someone went deeper than they should have, when the buffer was breached, were managed as well, with the quiet efficiency of an institution that had been doing this for a very long time. The final night Calder returned to the hollow on a night in late November, 3 months after his first visit. He set up his equipment at the edge of the accessible terrain, within the range where his instruments functioned and outside the zone where the electromagnetic interference rendered them useless. He set up audio recording, thermal imaging, and a standard video camera that he left running continuously. He settled into wait. The forest was cold and absolutely still. The stars were clear above the ridgeline to the east, the sky that particular shade of deep blue that appears only at high elevation on windless winter nights. For 2 hours nothing happened, and then the forest went silent. Not quiet. It had been quiet throughout, the quietness of a remote mountain wilderness in the dead season. But at a specific moment, every sound that remained, the occasional crack of a branch cooling in the night air, the distant sound of a stream somewhere in the valley below, the barely perceptible rustle of leaves in a breeze he couldn't feel, stopped, all at once, as if someone had pressed a button. In the silence from the ridge below his position, a knocking sound. He had heard recordings of knocking sounds reported in these mountains. They appear in accounts going back decades, described consistently as wood striking wood, a sharp impact repeated in patterns that varied from location to location, but maintained an underlying structure that resisted classification as a random natural sound. He had always assumed, listening to the recordings, that he was hearing something he could find a conventional explanation for, something that could be attributed to a woodpecker's activity, to the thermal expansion of tree trunks in changing temperatures, to the acoustic trickery that mountain terrain sometimes played with distant mechanical sounds. Listening to the sound in person, in the total silence of a stopped forest, that confidence evaporated. It was a knock, a single knock, precise and deliberate, coming from somewhere below him in the dark, and then from a different direction, a direction that would have placed the source miles away from the first, separated by terrain that no person was moving through on that night. A response. The same pattern, echoed back with modifications that suggested not random acoustic reflection but intentional answer. Then, from a third location, farther still, the same pattern again, modified again, as if three sources separated by miles of mountain wilderness were conducting a conversation, as if information was passing between them through a medium that he was only hearing the surface expression of, the underground network translating vibration into sound at specific emergence points, carrying a signal across a distance that should have made communication impossible. He tracked the thermal camera toward the nearest emergence point. The sound was coming from a section of cliff face approximately 300 meters below his position, the rock dark in the absence of light, the camera's display showing the area in the false colours of thermal imaging. He almost missed it. At the edge of the cave opening that the thermal camera revealed, an opening he had not seen on his daytime visit, concealed by an overhang of rock that hid its existence from above, something emerged. Tall, very tall, taller than the cave mouth suggested should have been possible, moving with a smoothness that registered on the camera as a continuous fluid adjustment, rather than the distinct foot-by-foot movement of any animal locomotion he knew. Pale in the thermal display, not the bright orange-red of a warm-blooded mammal, but cooler, more muted, closer in temperature to its environment than any surface animal should have been. It stopped at the entrance to the cave. It stood there for a long time, long enough that Calder, watching the thermal display with a stillness born of something he did not want to identify as terror, had time to observe it in detail. It was not hunting. There was nothing in its posture, in the positioning of its body in relation to his own position, that read as the behaviour of a predator assessing prey. It was not displaying, the way an animal displays when it detects a perceived threat. It was not moving toward him or away from him. It was watching, standing at the mouth of its entrance into the surface world, far below him on the dark cliff face, aware of him with a precision that defied the darkness and the distance, aware of the equipment he was carrying, aware of what he had been doing in this place, aware, perhaps, of him specifically in a way that implied a knowledge of human individual identity that he was not prepared to consider, and watching, not with hostility, not with the aggressive readiness of something deciding whether to attack, with the patient, evaluating attention of something conducting an assessment, something that had encountered his presence in its territory and had decided, after whatever internal deliberation governed its responses, to come and look. Then it was gone, back through the cave mouth, into the mountain, in a movement so quick that the thermal camera barely caught the transition. The forest stayed silent for 3 minutes after it disappeared. Then, all at once, every sound returned. The branch crack, the distant water, the leaf rustle in the unfelt breeze, as if permission had been given, as if the assessment had concluded. Epilogue. The oldest mountains. Here is what we know. The Appalachian Mountains are 480 million years old. They are the oldest mountain range in North America, one of the oldest on Earth, survivors of geological catastrophes that reshaped the planet's entire surface while they endured. They contain, in their deep interior, a network of subsurface structures that multiple federal scientific agencies have documented, studied, and classified over more than 100 years of systematic investigation. Those structures are not natural formations. The geological record of the Appalachian region does not support their formation by any process that geologists understand. They were there before the mountains reached their maximum height. They may have been there before the mountains existed at all, in the period of ancient geological history when the terrain that would eventually produce the Appalachians was still the floor of a shallow inland sea. Something has been living in those structures for a very long time, not monsters, not supernatural entities, not beings from another world or another dimension, or any of the other categories that popular culture has invented for things it cannot explain. Living organisms, shaped by the same evolutionary pressures that have shaped every species on Earth, adapted to their specific environment with the thoroughness that hundreds of millions of years of natural selection can produce. Different from us in ways that are difficult to fully conceptualize, but operating under the same basic logic of survival that governs every living thing. Aware of the world above them in ways we don't fully understand, responsive to incursion into their territory in ways that the federal government has been quietly managing for more than a century. The national parks and national forests of the Appalachian region serve purposes that their official designations don't acknowledge. The missing persons whose disappearances cluster along the network's geography are paying a price that the managing institutions have apparently decided is acceptable and manageable. The sounds that residents of mountain communities have been reporting for generations, the electromagnetic anomalies that have been disrupting communications and navigation for as long as anyone has been measuring them, the wildlife managers who file reports in a category that should not exist. All of it connects to a reality that the relevant agencies understand and have chosen, for reasons they consider sufficient not to share. There is a line in the 1971 Monitoring Directive, a line that Calder has read so many times that it has become a permanent feature of how he understands both the document and the landscape it describes. Surface awareness unacceptable. They are aware of us. They have been aware of us for as long as humans have been in these mountains. They knew us before we knew them, in the way that something that can hear a footstep through 300 feet of rock knows the shape and rhythm and intention of what walks above it before that thing ever looks up and notices what is looking back. The monitoring continues. The buffer is maintained. The parks remain open for the hikers and the campers and the people who drive up the Skyline Drive on autumn weekends to look at the foliage. But somewhere below those parks, below the trails and the campgrounds and the scenic overlooks, in chambers that have existed since before complex life crawled out of the ocean, the network extends from Alabama to Pennsylvania, and something is listening. Something that has been listening since before we existed. Something that, 480 million years into a story that began before ours did, is still here, still listening, still watching, still waiting for us to understand that we are not the oldest thing in these mountains, we are simply the newest. And the mountains, patient, ancient, indifferent to the brief human drama playing out on their weathered surfaces, have been keeping that secret for longer than we have had language to ask the question. The boots are still beside the sleeping bag. The fire is still warm. The GPS tracker sent its last signal at 2:13 in the morning, 62% battery remaining, from coordinates that correspond almost exactly to a void in the official geographic record of that section of Pisgah National Forest. Daniel Mercer has not been found. He will not be found. And in the quiet hollows of the oldest mountains on Earth, in the darkness below the darkness we can see, something continues its patient, unbroken observation of the surface world above it, watching us the way we watch an anthill, with the particular detached interest of something vastly older, encountering something new, something loud and brief and blindly confident in its own centrality, something that has not yet understood that it arrived late to a world that was already, in every meaningful sense, occupied. The mountains have always known. They are 480 million years old. They have time.